It's been 22 years since the NFL adopted the Rooney Rule, and with so many corporations going psych when it comes to their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, now seems like an appropriate time to check in on the impact of the Rooney Rule. First, let's start with why the Rooney Rule was even created, because it seems like whenever we have a conversation about why any measure is adopted to correct systemic inequity, people never paint the full picture about the origin story. In 2002, the late Johnnie Cochran, who famously got O.J. Simpson acquitted for double murder, and civil rights attorney Cyrus Mehri, who won huge discrimination lawsuits against Texaco and Coca-Cola, they threatened to sue the NFL for racial discrimination. Now, what drove Cochran and Mehri to threaten the NFL with the lawsuit was the firings of Tony Dungy, who was then the coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Dennis Green, who was fired even though he had made the playoffs 8 of 9 seasons as head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I'm sorry, if you mentioned Dennis Green, it's like, you gotta play that clip.
The Bears are who we thought they were. And that's why we took the damn field. Now, if you want to crown them, then crown their ass. But they are who we thought they were. And we let them off the hook.
Thanks, Coach.
The awkward thanks, coach, it just kills me every time. Anyway, the firings of both Dungy and Green drew some raised eyebrows. When Dungy was let go, the Bucs were 54-42 in his 6 seasons in Tampa, during which the Bucs went to the playoffs 4 times, including appearing in the 1999 NFC Championship game. Now, before Dungy became the coach, the Bucs had only made the playoffs 3 times in 20 seasons, and as a franchise had a 30% win percentage. With the championship roster, the Bucs won the Super Bowl the season after Dungy was fired with John Gruden, who during his 7 seasons in Tampa only made the playoffs twice after winning the Super Bowl and finished with a 60-57 overall record. Green, meanwhile, guided the Vikings to 2 appearances in the NFC Championship, 4 division titles, and they only missed the playoffs twice in his 10 seasons. Now, Green also was only the 2nd black coach in NFL history. Now, attorneys Cochran and Mehri, they saw these firings as emblematic of a deeper systemic problem in the NFL. In 1921, Fritz Pollard became the NFL's first black head coach, only it wasn't known as the NFL then, but the American Professional Football Association. It would be 68 years before the NFL had another black head coach, Art Shell, who took over for the Raiders in 1989. When the Rooney Rule was adopted in 2003, the NFL only had 5 black coaches in its history. Since the Rooney Rule was adopted roughly 22 years ago, there have been 139 head coaches in the NFL, and only 26 haven't been white. Now, considering how long it took the NFL to get its first black coach in the modern era, and that entering this season there were 9 minority coaches, you could make an argument that the Rooney Rule has kinda sorta made some progress. But as we've seen through this most recent hiring cycle, and by no means was this the first year this happened, the Rooney Rule also puts minority coaches and owners in awkward positions. It also, in some ways, degrades minority coaches who are just looking to be given a fair shot. Now, since this current administration is insistent on weaponizing DEI and dragging us back to the days of whites only, should the Rooney Rule be the next casualty? Is it time for it to go? Let's ask the important question. Is the lack of black and minority coaches an issue of race? Let me give you the definition of systemic racism according to Merriam-Webster. It means the oppression of a racial group to the advantage of another as perpetuated by inequity within interconnected systems such as political, economic, and social systems. In 2022, the Washington Post did a special investigative report called How the NFL Blocks Black Coaches. It is a thorough and comprehensive report backed by data. Some of the conclusions drawn from this report are these. Black coaches tend to perform about as well as white coaches. But while white candidates are offered a vast and diverse set of routes to the league's top coaching jobs, black coaches face a much narrower set of paths. They have had to serve significantly longer as mid-level assistants, are more likely to be given interim jobs than full-time ones, and are held to a higher standard when it comes to keeping their jobs. Since 1990, black coaches have been twice as likely as others to be fired after leading a team to a regular season record of 500 or better. Now, I'm sure as I'm relaying this data, some of you are riding fast into the comments section to say, it's not about color or race, it's about the best person for the job. Well, was it about the best person for the job when the NFL went almost 70 years without a black head coach? In the 20 years that passed after the Rooney Rule, only 11% of the head coaches hired were black. So does that mean All the white guys were simply just smarter. Let's not forget, the history of the NFL is filled with examples of the league being in lockstep with systemic racism. In 1934, George Preston Marshall, the owner of the Washington football team, and by the way, remembering why I'm avoiding using their old nickname? Another hint. Anyway, George Preston Marshall executed his secret plan to ban black players from the league. It's a history the NFL probably doesn't love to talk about because Marshall didn't act alone. He convinced other prominent NFL families to join the ban, and some of those families still own NFL teams today. The Mars, who own the Giants, and wouldn't you know, also the Rooneys. Now, this isn't to say that you can't atone for a racist past, but how much has the NFL really atoned? There are still 5 NFL franchises that have never had a permanent black head coach. We witnessed Colin Kaepernick having his entire career destroyed because he took a knee during the national anthem to protest against racial injustice. Meanwhile, Nazi salutes by the de facto president, totally cool. It was just in 2021 that the NFL agreed to ban race norming, a practice the league willingly engaged in to deny black retirees access to the NFL's multi-billion-dollar concussion settlement. Race norming is the practice of assuming that black players have lower cognitive abilities. So if a former black player is presumed to have a lower cognitive ability, then it is concluded he has been impaired less due to playing football. Kinda fucked up, isn't it? Now remember, in this same league, it was accepted that black players were not smart enough to play quarterback and could not be the leader of men. That same mentality also existed when it came to black coaches. But it wasn't just this undercurrent of systemic racism that minority coaches are up against, it's also nepotism. In 2022, there were 717 on-field coaches in the NFL, and at least 93 of those coaches, or 13% of them, had a father, son, or brother who was a current or former NFL head coach. 76% of those family connections were white. USA Today Sports analyzed 79 father-son connections, and they found nearly half of the sons got their first NFL jobs on the same staffs as their father. Now, I think you can guess the race of those sons and fathers. This past hiring cycle, we saw examples of NFL teams engaging in sham interviews to meet Rooney Rule requirements, which mandates that teams interview 2 external minority candidates for a head coaching position and 1 external candidate for a coordinator position. To satisfy the Rooney Rule, several teams interviewed black candidates that they had no interest in hiring. The Cowboys, for example, hired Matt Eberflus, the recently fired Chicago Bears head coach, for their defensive coordinator position. And even though there were reports that said Eberflus was their guy, they couldn't make the hire official until they interviewed a minority candidate. Now enter Chicago Bears secondary coach Andre Curtis, who interviewed with Dallas and allowed them to meet the Rooney Rule criteria. Now, if you're Andre Curtis, do you still interview even though you know you aren't getting the job? Now, some would say he should do it just to get an idea of what these head coaching interviews are like. Some would counter and say, why play the token? But the problem isn't the rule. The problem is that there has been no real punishment for violating the Rooney Rule, at least not a punishment that would make teams and owners think twice about not taking the process seriously. In 2003, the Detroit Lions were fined $200,000 for violating the Rooney Rule because they didn't interview a minority candidate before they hired Steve Mariucci. The Lions didn't lose any draft picks, and to date, they are the only team that has ever been punished behind the Rooney Rule. Former NFL Players Union President D. Smith pointed out in a piece for Yale Law Policy and Review, the Rooney Rule isn't a rule, but merely a suggestion, because the NFL has no outside entity that determines punishment, and owners simply don't fear any of the consequences. Smith wrote, fines should start at $5 million and escalate for individuals and clubs who violated the adopted system. The reality is that teams do not care about draft picks or minor fines as punishment for violating league guidelines. The proof is that we still have consistent and repeated violation of the Rooney Rule process and have not achieved the Rooney Rule's goal. The NFL uses significant fines to police player conduct, both on and off the field, claiming that these fines promote uniformity and protect the NFL product. It is ironic that the league has not adopted a similar zero-tolerance fine structure when it comes to achieving a fair and inclusive workplace. Now, I know many people think you can't legislate behavior or fairness, but in this country, that's the only way any sort of progress has ever been made. People have never decided out of the goodness of their heart to adopt equality as a practice. look no further than the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. It always has been by force and through a painful process. Considering our willingness historically to legislate inequality, it seems we should keep that same energy when it comes to correcting inequality. I'm Jemele Hill, and I approve this message.